Done. This quilt is just magnificent. I haven't seen anything quite as pretty as it is. Oh, who all had a part?
Kate, where's Kate? Carol.
People had a part in the quilt.
Raise your hand. And actually,
I'm gonna
everybody
ask
in the church, raise your hand, because you have donated money to us for our supplies. So everybody raise your hand.
Everybody raise your hand.
Because honestly, we couldn't have done it alone without, just the three of us could not have done this. So it's all of the group effort. And we also want to acknowledge Sarah,
Recording
her
right here.
family. The Chesbros are members of our church, and Sarah's their daughter. She has this wonderful studio in Athens called So Studio, and not in Athens, in Bogart, outside of Athens. And she has a wonderful quilt shop there. It's been in business now about, 3 years, Sarah? And has just developed into an exquisite quilter with a long arm machine. So if you know anybody that needs a long-armed quilter, she did this for us. And you can look at the beauty of the quilting.
Oh, if you don't know what a long-arm quilting machine is, most of you know what a regular sewing machine looks like. And if you have to do quilting on something that big, you can't roll it up tight enough to go through the throat of the machine. A long-arm machine has all the sewing part business stuff on 12-foot long rails that you wrap the quilt around. And so you go back and forth with the working part of the quilter and roll it and back and anyway, it's impossible to do that
come
on
here a minute.
domestic sewing machine.
Guess who's learning to quilt on the long arm? Zoe is in 5th grade, and she stands on a box to reach because the long arm is too tall for her. So she has a box that she stands on, but there's this gadget that you do like this. And so imagine little Zoe taking this. But I hear that she's becoming quite confident.
Yes,
So
she has done
she might
6
be
quilts
doing
so
us a
far.
favor instead of her mother.
Wonderful.
Thank you,
Zoe.
So it's just a wonderful thing, but this project happened so strange. Lanya asked me what was my inspiration, and I said, well, 16 years ago, I made this quilt for my daughter, and she was struggling in a class of self-contained learning disability students that were not liking to read and couldn't read and had not much motivation. So I said, we need to find something that they want to read. So I just thought about this, and I said, okay, it's coming up Black History Month. We're going to do this and go into a classroom in your school, not the auditorium and not a big deal. We're going to get a small audience, and we're going to do this. And so we did. And it was so successful. Those kids just bought into it. And the first day, on Monday, I went over. I was going to spend the week helping her teach. We went over on Monday with the quilt, and I said, these are the cards. I'm giving each of you a block to talk about. And I kind of downsized the words. And I said, but now there's a stipulation here. These are conditions. You got to go home every day and practice reading this. On Friday, you got to be able to read it with no errors and no silliness and no joking. This is serious. So I said, if you can't do it, let me know. So don't do it. And I said, get your parents to help you, which brought in the parent involvement that we rarely get. So by Friday, those cards were very battered. They had been reading every day. And guess what? We went into that classroom and they read without missing a word.
What grade level was that?
Yeah, they were, actually it was a self-contained learning disability class, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and a lot of them were boys. Not all, but a lot. And each one had a block, and I said, you've got to learn the block, you've got to read, and you've got to behave yourself. Those are the conditions. And if you, in the middle of our program, start acting up, I'll take your card and let someone else read it, and you can go wait in the hall. And they did. They were mostly on medication for hyperactivity. They were perfect. They stood in line. They calmed down. and they had a motivation. So when I started thinking about we needed another project after giving abundance quilts to this group and that group, I thought, well, let's do one special quilt for some reason. And I thought about that Underground Railroad quilt that we had done so many years ago and resurrected this book, which was my inspiration that time. This book was printed in, I think it was 1999, I think. And actually, yeah, and this was 2003. This one was 2000. So apparently this book started out first, and these two quilter ladies got together and wrote the pattern book to go along with the history book of this novel here. And this is entitled Hidden in Plain View, The Story of Quilts and the Underground Railroad. And it's written by Jacqueline Tobin and Raymond C. Dobard, PhD. And so after this book was printed, these ladies wrote the quilt book. So the four people are part of this story, along with Ozella McDaniels Williams, who was the lady at the marketplace in Charleston that started the whole thing. So let's begin the story. And I did write a narrative here so that I would not get sidetracked. The story began in 1994 when Jacqueline Tobin went to Charleston. Actually, she was going down there to learn more about Sweetgrass baskets, loading with debris. And this is a Sweetgrass basket. How many of you have never heard of this? Okay. These are the African American craftswomen are specialized in making these. And if you go to Charleston, you'll see little roadside stands with ladies sitting there selling these. They're very expensive now and very sought after.
Yes.
But this is used in for a variety of things. Our daughter has now lived in Mount Pleasant 6 years, and she gave us this one Christmas because it was exciting to her. So anyway, we're talking about Charleston today. So the story begins when Jacqueline went down there to actually learn about the Sweetgrass baskets. Never had in her mind about quilts. And so she is, while walking through the city market, she sees a booth there with Ozella McDaniels Williams sitting with all these nice, colorful quilts piled up. So she was sort of browsing around and saw it had an interest in one of the quilts. And so Ozella comes up to her and says, let's see, what does she say? Did you know, let me find it. Did you know that the quilts served as a communication code for the Underground Railroad? And she started talking softly then, and Jacqueline Tobin could hardly understand her with the noise of the marketplace. So she's listening politely but does not ask questions. And Ozella talked a little bit and then just stopped talking. And so Jacqueline bought a quilt and picked up a brochure and left and went home. And so about 4 months later, she came across that brochure, picked it up, and she had been really thinking about this for a while. So she got on the phone and called her to see if she could, and she said, I'm so-and-so, and I saw you at the city marketplace. Could you tell me the rest of the story? And Ozella, this is what's so interesting. She said, Ozella curtly said that she couldn't talk right now and to call her the next day. So she did call the next day, and Ozella told her she couldn't speak again right that day, and laughed quietly into the telephone and started sort of whispering, "Don't worry, you'll get the story when you are ready." And she hung up. so Jacqueline thought, well, what is going on with this lady? She starts telling me something, and now she's backing off. So she began some research on her own to explore the story further. And so she then called and conversed with Dr. Raymond Dobard, who was an art history professor at Howard University. And he also happened to be an advanced quilter himself, as well as an expert on African American quilts. And he too was African American. So Jacqueline suggested that Raymond then pursue the research with Ozella, thinking that he would have better luck. And he declined and said, no, I think you'd be better, because it seems that she was comfortable enough with you to start the story. So he put it back on her, and that she would then get the rest of the story when you are ready, he says to her. So this ready thing started showing up often. So then 3 years later, in 1997, without notifying Ozella, Jacqueline returned to Charleston, and during a carriage ride through the marketplace, she saw that Ozella was still there at the booth. And oh, by the way, Ozella's outfit was a white blouse painted with a huge lavender flower and a white hat that had a huge lavender flower on it, and black pants. And so here again, she had the same costume on. And so she went to the booth, and Ozella remembered her. And so she immediately started making a seat for her with the quilts and comfortable, and had her to sit down. And she turned to Jacqueline and said, now, sit down and write this down. It was time. So then she told her the story. So I guess she had to really know that she was sincerely interested and would be at the right time. So she wasn't quick to carry this on. Now the information in the book tells us that it came from Ozella's mother and her grandmother. And the book is dedicated with the names of Ozella and her mother, but not the name of the grandmother. So I'm thinking that because of not writing and not having literary skills, that maybe they didn't know the name of the grandmother. But those three are part of the dedication of the book. And so some find Ozella's story unbelievable, while others are intrigued with the oral history and feel the importance of the quilt blocks as a part of the movement to freedom, and is very believable. Since there is no actual proof, however, each reader can form his own personal opinion. So you may not agree with this, but I agree with this because I feel like it has a lot of validity. So now we're getting ready to read the story. And we've got readers, and mine is the first block. And after that, you're numbered. This first block is called Jacob's Ladder. All right, so we're going to read the Jacob's Ladder. Underground Railroad has an alternating path of dark and light and can be used to show directions. So here you've got the alternating pattern, and it goes upward, and that's the direction. All right, so if they were to use this in any way, a designer of a quilt would make sure that if you're trying to give directions with this quilt, you would want to show the direction with the placement of, because you can turn quilt blocks around in any place. So if you wanted to get direction, you would go in one direction or another. All right. There's a story about a slave owner chasing a runaway who swore the man vanished as if he had stepped on some kind of Underground Railroad. The idea of Underground Railroad taking people north to freedom was used to describe the network of abolitionists and safe houses that helped slaves escape to Ohio and Canada. Safe houses along the way were known as stations. Those who guided the escapees were called conductors, and the runaways themselves were called passengers. Okay? So now we're ready to listen to the second block, well, actually the first block, number one. Who has number one?
Right here.
Okay,
Monkey wrench.
okay. Monkey, here, Monkey, come on up.
I know that's a rule for that. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm gonna get out of the way. Here, okay, excuse me.
All right, so point out which one is the
Yes,
monkey wrench.
yeah.
Is that
The middle one on the top.
very good? The monkey wrench, a heavy metal tool used by blacksmiths. I'm a welder, by the way, so this kind of fits. This quilt was the first quilt to be displayed as a signal for any slaves who planned to escape. This quilt symbolized the time to collect tools they would need on their journey north to freedom. Tools were needed for constructing a shelter and for defending themselves, for determining direction. Food and a few coins were to be wrapped in a bandana bundle. Mental tools were needed, being cunning and alert, having knowledge, and an ability to discern motives of strangers.
Okay. Number two.
Okay, this is the wagon wheel quilt. The wagon wheel quilt was a message to pack provisions for their journey as if they were packing a wagon. Wagons with hidden compartments were one of the primary means of transporting escaping runaways. Considering limited space and weight, they should pack supplies that would be essential for survival. Sunbonnets could help fleeing slaves disguise themselves by obscuring their faces. The wagon was also symbolic of a chariot that was to carry them home. The spirituals they sang carried hidden messages such as "Swing low, sweet chariot." Wagon wheel quilt.
Number 3, it is the carpenter's wheel quilt. It was a secondary code pattern. To a slave, the master carpenter in their lives. As they worked in the fields, they sang this well-known spiritual about a chariot that was to carry them home. The hidden message was a directive to plan their escape. They were to follow the carpenter's wheel to the west and northwest.
Number 4 is the Bearpaw Quilt. The Bearpaw Quilt directed the runaways to follow an actual trail of bear's footprints. Animal footprints would indicate the best path, just like a road map through the mountains. Following the bear's paws would also lead tired, hungry runaways to food and water. Most escapes took place in the spring. With spring rains, it would be easy to follow a bear's path trail to food and safety.
Number 5, the basket block quilt. What's this one? The basket block quilt is a symbol of the provisions needed for the long journey north. One of the most difficult things faced by escaping slaves was feeding themselves along the journey. They depended on safe houses or friends along the way. Abolitionists would give them baskets of provisions and tools, such as flint and compasses, to aid them in their flights. The basket block quilt.
This is the Crossroads Quilt. The Crossroads Quilt revealed to fugitives who had made it safely through the Appalachian Mountains that they were to travel to the Crossroads, or a city where they would find protection and refuge. The main crossroads or terminal was Cleveland, Ohio. Detroit, Michigan was another crossroads. 4 or 5 overland trails connected with Cleveland, and numerous water routes crossing Lake Erie into Canada and freedom.
This is the, excuse me, the log cabin quilt block with a black center hanging in front of a house indicated it was a safe house. A yellow center indicated a light or beacon in the wilderness. William Lloyd Still, famous black Underground Railroad conductor, had a log cabin quilt with a yellow center in his Philadelphia family home. The usual center color of the block was red, representing the hearth or fire of the cabin, which would have been a very important aspect in a colonial home.
So the fact that it was black instead of red was significant in the secret code that the slave catcher would not recognize right away.
This is the shoe fly quilt. It represents an actual person who might have helped escaping slaves. His responsibility was to secretly aid and harbor fugitives. Sometimes the slaves hid out in churches or caves, referred to as cathedrals. Graveyards were frequently the hiding place as well. Shoe fly.
I have the Bowtie Quilt. The Bowtie Quilt was displayed on the fence to teach slaves how to escape to freedom. It was a message for them to dress in a formal manner. When slaves first escaped, they wore clothes that were distinguishable garments. These clothes became tattered and torn along their journey. Free blacks would often meet them in a safe place as a church and give them fresh clothing. In satin bow ties, runaways wouldn't stand out among the city folks.
I have the Flying Geese quilt. The Flying Geese quilt tells the runaways that they were to take their direction, timing, and behavior from migrating geese. Since geese fly north in the spring, it was also the best time for the slaves to escape. Geese have to stop at waterways along their journey in order to rest and to eat. Since geese make loud honking noises, it was easy for runaways to follow their flight pattern. This block could act as a compass. A clever quilter wishing to assist the runaways could show off direction simply by making one set of geese distinct from the other. The Flying Geese quilt.
You see that on Lake Oconee all the time, the geese, really.
Yes.
And they do honk loud.
Oh, it's not just at the lake.
My wife tried to get me to follow them the other day.
Oh, no.
Towards the dam.
Jimmy, you're too much.
This is the Birds in the Air quilt. The Birds in the Air quilt is symbolic of flight or migration. A clever quilter could indicate a direction for fugitives to travel through the choice of fabric and the placement of blocks. The light and dark contrast creates an arrow pointing north. This block was originally designed in Pennsylvania by the wife of Quaker Lindley Coates, abolitionist, who ran Safe House No. 5 on the Underground Railroad. Birds of the Air quilt.
This one down here is the Drunkard's Path quilt.
That should have been Jimmy's.
I know. Told the slaves to move in a staggering fashion to elude any following slave hunters. They were to even double back occasionally on their tracks to confuse slave catchers who were pursuing them. Drunkard's Path.
The sailboat block quilt is a symbol of safe passage to freedom. It also represents the importance of free black sailors to the Underground Railroad. Runaway slaves weren't safe until they reached Canada. Many depended on ships and ferries to cross icy Lake Erie. The Compromise of 1850 allowed slaveholders to retrieve slaves in northern states and free territories.
This is the North Star block. It represents the North Star as the guiding light leading slaves to Canada and freedom. The Big Dipper always points to the North Star, which is the handle of the Little Dipper. The North Star was also important to navigation, especially to boat owners who took the slaves from Cleveland or Detroit to Canada.
Fascinating stories.
Okay, so we have learned about the secret code. All right, let me give you a little bit more information about secret codes. Tribes in Africa had many languages. Secret codes were a form of communication. And so often they had the drum beats and different things, different ways that they communicated within their tribe that the other tribes would not recognize. So when the slaves came over, they were very much, this was part of their culture, to have the secret code as part of their communication, as well as remember no handwriting and no reading was going on. So, and also back to the monkey wrench. He was the blacksmith on the plantation. He was kind of the main person in this story because he had access to a lot of resources. And he was also on loan because all plantations did not have a blacksmith. So he would be on loan to other plantations in the surrounding area. So he had knowledge of the layout of the land, the geometry and the hills and the rivers and so forth. So he could give directions and information for them, which was going to be necessary for them. And so he was very vital in this story. He also had a secret code with using his hammer and anvil as he did his work. He had certain rhythms that conveyed a certain message. So it was really kind of unique how all of this came together. You have to think about the group effort, the ingenuity, and which makes me think of one of the, in reading the book of Tobin, I came across the Harriet Tubman character. How many of you have ever heard of Harriet Tubman? Well, you know, she grew up around Augusta. Did you all realize that she was from Augusta? And there's actually a middle school, when I was growing up in Thompson, which was only 30 miles away, there was a junior high school was named Tubman Junior High School. And so that was way back in the 50s. And so Harriet Tubman was a conductor. She also had a school named after her, and she made 19 trips after she became free. She went back 19 times to help other slaves in their journey. And so the attributes that were listed in the book on Harriet were faith, hope, tenacity, ingenuity, courage, wit, generosity, endurance, perseverance, and all of those qualities seem to be spilling over into the other slaves that were trying to make and she also used songs and spirituals to convey a fugitive's indicating safety. She had one song that says, "This is not a safe place." She had another song that says, "This is a safe place." And so anyone listening, and possibly a slave catcher, would not pick up on the differences in these spiritual songs. But the slaves knew what each one meant. And several of them are listed in the book. I would highly recommend, if you have some time, to read this book. Not only is it the two authors have contributions, there are about 4 or 5 other people that have written chapters that go into this book, as well as the research that they did. There are 15 pages in this book of bibliography of the research that these two people did to come up with this. And it was so much on the different things. So now I think I want to end this with saying that this is not the end of the story, because see, once Ozella told her the story, she still had some information to find. And so she, let's see, it was, okay, so there remained one more task, a return to the griot. And griot in the African custom is a storyteller. And so Ozella had been a griot, mentor, and she wanted to go back one more time to have a conversation with her. Did not know why. She said, don't know why I wanted to go back, but I knew I had to. So she sadly found out that Ozella was no longer health-wise able to be at the market. So she goes to her home where she was living with her older brother. So they sat in the living room again with this same rose on the white hat and the rose on the white shirt. And she sat in the living room among piles and piles of handmade quilts. Now, handmade means no sewing machine was involved. All of these little pieces would have been stitched by hand, stitched together. Now, Father Bill has become an expert on that. So if y'all want to talk to him about hand quilting, I would recommend his expertise.
Very expert,
Okay.
yes.
So back to us. We do machine quilting, machine piecing. So her face and body were no longer animated and lively. She now reflected a tiredness earned through a lifetime of work, but she still had the twinkle in her eye. So once again, she told Jacqueline to sit down. As she talked, her brother stayed quiet. Ozella said that he heard the story also from mother and grandmother, who told all of us, but I was the only one who paid attention. Ozella had lived in Callison, South Carolina, and McCormick counties, where she grew up. Family would sit out under an big old oak tree and listen to the story over and over. And this is where we learned to quilt, sitting out there under the tree. And Ozella had no children to pass on the story. So Tobin and Dobard learned that she had attempted to tell the story to others, but no one demonstrated interest previously. So see, Jacqueline was the first one that really pursued and carried it further, and that's how this came about. Her nephew stated, "My aunt has never told the entire story to anyone at one time." So she was very careful about what she did. Now, these are the questions that Tobin then, after this visit, asked herself. Was I the only one who had persisted in getting the story? Was I the only one who had paid attention when she spoke? Was I the child entrusted to keep the family story? Ozella then, in 2 weeks after this visit, Ozella passed away in Charleston on May 17th, 1998. And that was the last time that Jacqueline had seen her the 2 weeks prior. And so 98 was the last visit. 99, the book is copyrighted in 99, but I noticed in the preface that the first printing was 2000. So all of this after that last visit then was the wrap-up of getting the book ready for publication. So that's kind of how it all started. So she had a mission. Jacqueline Tobin, for some reason, had a mission to carry this out. And so that's where we are now. And I feel that this project it could have been a very difficult project. You see the complexity up here? But y'all, somehow it all came about. Kind of easily, really. One thing, every time we thought we had an obstacle or a little challenge, suddenly it was taken care of. And it was just no big deal.
And Carolyn made all the complicated parts. The rest of us just put the strips and the other things together.
Well, but that was still a group effort. And this was my initial thought. These girls have worked with me during this pandemic, and we've delivered 56 quilts to Circle of Love. We delivered 30 quilts over to Head Start. But these were simple patchwork, not real involved. They were just squares sewed together. And these ladies just took to everything like white on rice, and we've got these things finished. And I thought it's time for us to step up and do a little bit of complexity. But then it had been several years since I had looked at this book, so I took the book out. What? Look at all these tiny triangles. Look at all these little
The
pieces
drunkard's
here.
path is the most complicated one, because I've never sewn a.
Oh, the drunkard's path
bird
is the
seam
worst
before.
one.
Yeah.
But Eleanor Burns is notorious at her wonderful patterns. And she, see, you cut squares and then you cut a circle and all this stuff. Well, Eleanor has this great idea. She says cut one big square and take a round square and fuse it with fusible web in the middle. Iron it, and then cut it apart like that. And so you don't sew you don't have to sew this, because on that seam you've got a bias going. And you're going to not end up with everything the same size.
And if you look at it closely, Carolyn used a nice stitch on her machine to add some, it almost looks hand stitched on the curves. It's really, really nice
It's called,
detail.
if you look at this closely, it's called a blanket stitch, and my machine has that stitch on there. You punch the button and you just stitch across that line. And I can stitch across a line carefully, but not sew it from the backside, the curve. And so the drunkard's path was really kind of easier than I remembered, but I thought, I don't want to have some more dropouts in my quilt room.
Carolyn, tell him the story about the batch you picked up, and that is, I mean, really, that was such a sign.
I'm telling you what, we had divine intervention the whole way.
Yeah.
I mean, it was constantly those winks.
Thank you
My
again.
daughter gave you a book one time called God Winks, and he was winking the whole time because we just kept keeping on. At one point, after we finished making this, putting the quilt together, oh, and by the way, talking about Sarah before she's leaving. Sarah, hold on. We go up to take the quilt to her to get it quilted, and we didn't have a back yet, and we had been putting muslin on the backs of our other quilts, but we felt like this needed to be a little bit more special. So we go up and say to Sarah, now we need to get that backing from you, because she carries wider fabrics that we needed. And so we said, help us find one. Well, look at how perfectly Sarah went right to her stash of bolts, and she said, let's pick out 2 or 3, and then she said, but I really like this one.
It has a real subtle pattern to it. It's not a solid
Absolutely.
color.
It's not solid. When you come up close, you'll see it has a little check. But isn't that exquisite?
Beautiful.
She just went right to it. So she's just a super person and can find you to give you what you need. So she helped us in so many ways. And then if you'll notice the quilting, and then also it made it so easy on the edge, because when I got it back, and sometimes the long arm quilters, when you get one back from them, the edge will be kind of bumpy along the way, and you've still got to sew this part on here to bind it by hand on the back, but you sew it on the front. And so when I got it back, the edge was straight, even, flat, just smooth, and it took me just a quick time to sew the binding on. And I thought, gee, this has saved me about an hour of work because of her expertise. And so this is what we encountered. But I had spoken with Linda a couple of weeks before. She was at church, and I said, well, we've about finished, but now we've got to find out about how to quilt this thing. And she said, well, you know, Sarah now has a new long arm machine in the shop now. Ding, 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 ding. I said, oh, really? Ooh, that sounds good. So sure enough, Linda called the next week and said, bring it up. And so we did. And I have to tell y'all this. Linda and Scott donated the quilting.
Wow.
Oh, thank you so much.
That was a big contribution. Because we did have a little budget from the church, but it was going to deplete our budget. And so now we can go buy some other stuff.
We've also gotten some significant donations. One of them was anonymous. And so we've actually still got money in our fund for buying fabric and thread and batting.
Our charity quilts that we're giving away, I over years of quilting, I've got boxes, and my husband will he'll validate for this, that we need to get rid of. And so we are just cutting those things up in 4-inch, 5-inch, and 3-inch squares like you won't believe, and just running them through the mill. And we're making a dent, but we're also giving. And but this one was special, so we did have to spend some money. And and another divine intervention that I want to tell you about is, like, the husbands don't like to go to quilt shops really. And so we were going to Atlanta to go to a wedding that was really important. It was my husband's goddaughter getting married, and we were invited to the wedding. So the day or two before, I knew not to pop it on him on the way up there to Atlanta. So I said a couple of days, I really need you to take me by this quilt shop in Covington, because we really need to find some border, some sashing, and some corner square fabric that goes with what we're dealing with. And so I expected him to say, no, we're not going to do that then. But he was so kind and said yes, and he looked up and found out where the place was and how to get there. Took me there, and I took all the blocks with me. And this is another divine thing. We go in, and it's a feed and seed store that has quilting on the half one side and feed on the other side. So we go in, there's nobody there but me in the quilt side. The lady comes over, and I tell her what I'm doing. She says, well, let's go lay the blocks out on this big table. So we laid them out on the big table, and she says, now we'll just go get bolts and come over here. She spent maybe 30 minutes with me, and he was just very patient. So we have to. Thank you, Bob. That was a divine because this was not an expected reaction, actually. So, but she helped me select, and I knew the reason I wanted to go there. Sarah's shop has a lot of bright colors, and she doesn't carry as many of the what we call Civil War era color scheme, or I would have gone there. But this lady has Moda, which is a line that is similar to Civil War, and I was able to pick up on these and everything, so that worked out. And then, of course, this story that Connie wants me to tell is not really related, and I think I told this in church one day, though. We dedicated the quilts to Circle of Love. But Carol and I have met halfway through the pandemic to switch off bags of fabric, kits, I call them, at the end of Cary Station Road, right by the Waterworks. So we pull up there in the drive, and we get out of our cars, and we swap bags. We might look like little drug dealers, little ladies, but anyway, so we've been doing this for some time. So one day, she gave me a bag of finished quilts, 2 finished quilts, and I gave her one to work on. And I laid my bag on the back of my car. So we're talking, if you can believe that. And so then when we drove off, I didn't think about that bag on the back of my car. So I get just a little bit beyond where we were, maybe not even a quarter of a mile. And I thought, where's that bag? And I looked in the back seat, and it wasn't there. And I thought, oh goodness. So I turned around, came back. There was a trash truck there by then. And I said to him, did you see a bag? He said, yes, ma'am. I saw this man pick it up. It was in the road, and he went that way. And I thought, oh goodness. So I got back in my car, and I went home, and I thought, oh my goodness. What am I going to do? I have got to take these. It was before Christmas, and I had promised the Circle that I would be there before Christmas with the delivery. So I said, I've got to go home. I guess I'll have to make those 2 quilts in 2 days and get them over there, because I'm not going to let her down. So I got home, and that was about 5 or 6 o'clock. And this lady that cleans my house lives on Cary Station right there behind the Waterworks. And she called me that night and said, did you lose a bag with quilts in it? And I said, yes, I did. How did you know? And she says, well, Jerry, my husband, he came home at some point, and and he was at the middle of the day, and he was leaving to go back to meet her at the shop where she was working at Webb Brothers a couple of days a week. So she said he came in Webb Brothers with this bag, and when he opened it up, I realized that it looked like a pattern that you had given me, because she's a quilter. Can you believe all these things? And I said, golly, Mary, she saved me 2 days of labor finding it. Plus, how was I going to tell Carol about that? I would never face Carol using these quilts. So she saved my life that day. But those were the little things that just kept happening during the time that we were doing this quilt project. So I'll end this by saying that we're still open for students in our quilt guild because we need help, and I can teach. I have a real good way of teaching people to do what they really don't want to do. I learned that through 30 years of special education as a teacher, and I'll be glad to teach you something that you might not want to do. So just come on down. But we are going to get back in motion to meet at the church, and we bring our machines, we bring a little light lunch, and we just have a day together, and we work on a project together. We don't necessarily, but then during the pandemic, though, we were taking things home and doing the whole thing. And I have to say, Katie had a little bit more experience. Carol had not had any. She had an old machine that she said, I'll get out of the closet and see if it works. And at the beginning, she was a trooper. She was excited about learning, and she's become a master. She just makes hers are the neatest. She has the neatest intersections. Everything goes together very neatly. And so I have to applaud her, and Katie's too, that we have become a little bit stronger and more skilled. And Kate has developed some skills. She came in with no skills, and so she's doing some work too. And so if anybody's interested, just let us know. So,
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you.
thank you. Okay. It's time.